Topic 3. Social disadvantage. People with intellectual disability are more likely to experience social disadvantage, including multiple types of disadvantage. These experiences include structural disadvantage and discrimination, and result in high rates of social isolation and exclusion from full participation in community life. People with intellectual disability are more likely to experience social isolation and social exclusion. They are overrepresented amongst homeless populations and more likely to experience unemployment. 2012 data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics found 61% of people with intellectual disability were not in the labour force, compared with just under half of people with other disability types and 18% of people without a disability. The unemployment rate for people with intellectual disability was 20%, which was significantly higher than the unemployment rate for people with other types of disability at 8% and people with no disability at 5%. Only 12% of people with intellectual disability in the labour force were employed full-time, compared to 32% of people with other types of disabilities and 55% of people without a disability. People with intellectual disability often have poor education experiences. Approximately 60% of people with intellectual disability have severe communication limitations, and it is common for young people to leave school without basic levels of literacy and numeracy. Many children and young people are placed in special education classes by their 5th year at school, and those who are not often receive little extra schooling support. People with intellectual disability are much less likely to undertake tertiary education. People with intellectual disability are at much greater risk of experiencing poverty than other members of the population due to low levels of skill development, reduced capacity, and experiences of discrimination, all of which impact on their participation in employment and social opportunities that could contribute to financial security. People with intellectual disability are at increased risk of criminal victimisation. They are 1.5 times more likely to become the victims of crime, 2.9 times more likely to be physically assaulted, and 12.7 times more likely to be the victim of robbery. Children with intellectual disabilities are 3.4 times more likely to be abused than children without disabilities. People with intellectual disability are at increased risk of sexual assault and exploitation. Research suggests between 50 and 99% of people with intellectual and psychosocial impairments are subject to sexual abuse in their lifetime. Women remain the overwhelming victims of sexual assault, with 68% of women with intellectual disability sexually abused before they are 18, and over 90% of women with intellectual disability the victims of violent sexual encounters in their lifetime. Men with intellectual disability are at increased risk of sexual assault than men in the general population. People with intellectual disability are at increased risk of domestic violence and abuse. Women with disabilities are 40% more likely to be the victims of domestic violence than women without disabilities. People with intellectual disability experience high rates of illness, including obesity, nutritional problems, vision and hearing impairment, endocrine disorders, and hypertension. Epilepsy prevalence rates for people with intellectual disability are 22%, compared to 0.4 to 1% for the general population. People with intellectual disability experience high rates of hospitalisation for infections, respiratory problems, dental conditions, and skin disorders. At the same time, people with intellectual disability experience high rates of undiagnosed illness, and primary healthcare access by this population may be insufficient to meet their needs. People with intellectual disability are at increased risk of developing mental illness. However, signs of mental illness amongst this population are often missed by health professionals. 57% of people with intellectual disability under the age of 65 also experience some form of psychiatric disability. Research suggests that up to 41% of adults with intellectual disability engage in self-harming behaviour. People at increased risk of self-harm and suicide are those with limited verbal communication ability, vision or hearing impairments, dual diagnosis of mental illness and intellectual disability, or those who misuse alcohol and other drugs. Whilst people with intellectual disability are less likely to use substances, those who do are more likely to abuse substances. The experiences of social disadvantage discussed in this video are common life experiences for many people with intellectual disability. At the same time, it is important to remember that, like all of us, people with intellectual disability are individuals, with their own unique set of life experiences, skills, abilities and gifts. Service providers and supporters must get to know the people they work with as individuals, whilst remaining mindful of the wider context of experiences of stigma and social disadvantage that impact the lives of many people with intellectual disability. With the right supports, including advocacy and assistance to address social disadvantage and stigma, people with intellectual disability can achieve their hopes and dreams and experience lives of personal meaning and social inclusion. Thank you for listening to Topic 3. Topic 4 will explore the lived experience of intellectual disability with a focus on personal functioning and communication. But first, please return to the homepage and complete the Topic 3 learning activity.